now on to the Indian dynasties. Mauryan dynasty, founded by a guy named Chandragupta Maurya. Chandragupta Maurya. This is going to be very confusing. His name is Chandragupta Maurya.
It's in our notes.
It should be in your notes. You've read about him. That's all one name, and then Chandragupta Maurya. And he is going to be the guy that's going to be able to most centralize a region that had largely been decentralized for many centuries before.
How long was it decentralized?
The height of the Mauryan dynasty would be reached under his grandson named Ashoka, and we've already spoken a little bit about Ashoka. So the only guys that you need to be familiar with, really, it's just Ashoka, but we'll throw his name at you so you know where it all starts. Chandragupta Maurya, his grandson is Ashoka. Yes?
Was the Gupta and the Mauryan Empire named after him?
Yes and no. We'll get there in a moment, okay? But yes, it's confusing, all right? So the Mauryan dynasty is founded and centralized by Chandragupta Maurya. It's going to see its greatest heights under his grandson, Ashoka.
Was it Ashoka, the Buddhist guy?
Ashoka is the guy that adopted Buddhism and was largely responsible for having Buddhism spread throughout Southern Asia and ultimately to East Asia. Yes.
He also didn't push Buddhism onto his citizens.
Didn't force it, because you wouldn't want to force your citizens to become Buddhist, because the caste system of Hinduism did such a good job of keeping order. One name that pops up in your standards is called Kautilya, K-A-U-T-I-L-Y-A, Kautilya. And he is Chandragupta Maurya's chief minister, K-A-U-T-I-L-Y-A. Just as the Han dynasty is adopting ideas of Confucius, Chandragupta Maurya and the Mauryan dynasty are going to use this political and economic advisor, Kautilya, to help organize their system. There's not much we're going to deal with this outside of recognizing that he is by some considered to be the world's first political scientist. So it's his ideas on how the government should operate and how the economy should operate that are really going to set the stage for later thinkers to come.
So Kautilya helped organize...
He was, like a chief advisor to the government. Now, the Indian subcontinent, in addition to being varied religiously, which we've already talked about with Hinduism, you've got millions of gods representing every aspect of human life in different regions of society. The Indian subcontinent itself is quite varied geographically. All right? You've got massive mountain ranges in the north. You've got highlands and mountain ranges in the east and in the west. You've got river valleys and major rivers and some more minor rivers. You've got great physical, in terms of land, distinctions between the different parts of India, which has long made India, along with its religion, more difficult to unify. All right, it's hard. It's not one large, continuous, flat plateau area, for example. All right, so you've got a lot of regions that not only are geographically far from each other, but even areas that are relatively close might be separated by major mountains or valleys and things like this, making it harder to centralize. Yeah?
Kind of decentralizing.
So it was a decentralized state where local leaders would have more rule. It's the Mauryan dynasty that begins to be able to unify and control and dominate a lot of these local leaders. So at the height of the Mauryan dynasty, and we can see it's blue under Ashoka, by around 250 before the Common Era, the Mauryan dynasty is going to stretch and control almost all of the Indian subcontinent, except the very southern tip of India. Why not? That was just as far as they got. Not for lack of desire, it's just stretching further and further is more challenging. Eventually, though, most of these classical empires that we're going to talk about, outside attacks, especially coming from a group of Huns in the north, are going to lead to the downfall of the Mauryan dynasty. And then, remember, these governments are originally formed, centralized states are originally formed with the idea that people need someone to protect their stuff. Well, when the centralized state can no longer do that, when the centralized state can no longer keep outsiders out, people begin to rely on more local leadership again. So we get the rise of local rulers, the rise of local landlords becoming more important in the administration of the state, all right, and the end of the Mauryan dynasty. Much later, now we're into the Common Era. In fact, the 4th century of the Common Era, we have the rise of the Gupta dynasty. Oh, pardon me. This is Chandragupta Maurya. Pardon me. This is Ashoka. This is Ashoka, the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya. And we mentioned last week how he had his rock and pillar edicts. We looked, I think, at an image of one of his pillars where there were Buddhist inscriptions and thinking and teachings that would be spread throughout the Indian subcontinent to spread Buddhist teachings and ideas and how to live a peaceful life. This is one of the rocks that is inscribed with the Buddhist teachings. And so Ashoka would sprinkle these throughout his empire, and then that would help him maintain order within the empire. And they still obviously exist today. So the Gupta dynasty. You're going to notice right away that the Gupta Empire, which is going to be born in the around 400 BCE, it's going to rise and be able to centralize a lot of these loose principalities that the Mauryan dynasty used to control. But we notice the Gupta never is going to get nearly as big as the Mauryan dynasty once was, right? So the Gupta, we're really just talking about this central area here. They never stretch further south. Then you see that this darker blue area is called tributary states. A tributary state is another state with another ruler who is going to pay tribute, almost like paying a fee in order to keep these guys from taking you over. So if I'm a tributary state, I am paying tribute to another ruler, so he lets me do my own thing. I'm still connected to you. If I stopped paying tribute, he might come and conk me on the head. But as long as I keep paying my tribute, my taxes, I can continue to rule my local region as I see fit. So the Gupta dynasty never grows to the extent of the Mauryan dynasty. Yes?
Didn't the Mauryan dynasty have the first?
Yes. Mauryan first, then the Gupta.
And why did they lose all the land below?
This is a completely separate entity. There was never a Mauryan leader who said, "Oh, we can't take it anymore. Let's hand it over to the Gupta now, and they're going to run our empire." The Mauryan dynasty collapses in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and then we've got about 500 years that pass before the Gupta rises. Now there's other small kingdoms and principalities, but they're insignificant for the story of world history. The Gupta is important largely because of what we're going to talk about next week and a lot of their scientific and especially mathematic advancements that happen. This is seen as the golden age of Indian culture and learning is going to happen during the Gupta. So we'll talk more about that next week. Now, to be really confusing, the founder of the Gupta dynasty, his name, and I'm sorry for this, Chandragupta. So, Chandragupta is one name. Chandragupta Maurya, founder of the Mauryan dynasty. Chandra, space, Gupta, founder of the Gupta.
This is what I was confused.
This is confusing. They did not create their history to make it easier for future history students. Now, Chandragupta was not born Chandragupta, but he took that name. Why do you think Chandragupta took that name? Because he wanted to look like some guy who had some connection to this earlier and greatest empire of the Indian subcontinent. And we're going to see that a lot through history, right? Where young people take the name of someone else to give the impression that they maybe have some connection to it.
George Washington
Yeah.
Carver.
Sure.
So 500 years after the Mauryan Empire fell, this person decided to change their name to Chandra space Gupta because he...
To give connection to this
Chandra
greatest empire.
Mauryan
Yes.
existed.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. We will talk more about the Gupta dynasty next week, but in their end, in the 6th century of the Common Era, Again, outside nomadic tribes, a group called the White Huns, are going to come in and bring down the Gupta. So we're going to have a common trend of all of these classical empires eventually meeting their demise, largely because you can't keep the outsiders out anymore. Yeah?
Am I thinking about this wrong? But I thought that the Huns also took over China.
Yeah, it's a different group of Huns.
Okay.
Yep, a different. So I'll throw another name at you to attach to that. But yeah, it's a different group. The last thing to talk about today is the Persian Empire. Persia, and you guys, it's not on this map that I picked. So this is the Persian Gulf. All right, you guys know the Persian Gulf. Today, this is the country of Iran. Today, this is the country of Saudi Arabia. Right between them is the Persian Gulf. The Persian Gulf gets its name because there's a region just to the north of the Persian Gulf called Persia. That region was where, like, the ruling seat of an empire later known as the Persian Empire would be based. So the whole thing is eventually going to be called the Persian Empire because of Persia down here. All right? And we're going to talk about a major city, an important city of the Persian Empire called Persepolis. You guys might have heard of that because there's a book written about it. I think you guys read it in one of your English classes in here. So we'll talk about that at a later date. I had a hand in the back.
Yeah, I guess the city that's all the way on the right of the map was Bacteria. Or can I not?
Bactria. Yeah, you would not want to move to Bacteria. Which in the neighborhood next door to ours, my wife's a French teacher, so I can learn these things from her. But in the neighborhood, there's a street called Malheur, which means in French, bad times. And who would move onto that street? That seems to... but anyway, are you familiar? Of course you know all about camels, Hannah? Shh. Okay, there's two kinds of camels, right? There's dromedary camels, and then there's Bactrian camels, all right? The Bactrian camels, and one's got two humps, one's got one hump. The dromedary has one, the Bactrian camels have two. Bactrian camels are often also, like, hairier, right? Because much of their existence is in much colder areas, like still desert areas, but much colder than the dromedary that we see more so in Arabia and in North Africa. Yeah?
Is Memphis actually in Egypt?
The original, well, one is in Tennessee, but then there's an original Memphis. Yeah. Do you think... Sometimes we name things after other older, greater things so we can, like, be reminded of their greatness. So do you think we call our Memphis Memphis because of the classical Memphis? Maybe. Maybe. Anyway, the Persians. The Persian Empire, we've already briefly mentioned them. Important for Persia, and we'll talk about this next week as well, is its location, okay? In fact, this location of the world, for much of world history, is going to be the most crucial and important location point on the globe. Because we have right here, a connection between two continents. All right, we got Europe up here, Asia up here. And of course, within this Persian Empire and in this whole region, we've got a connection between three continents, with Africa down in the south. So if you talk about the three most important aspects to any real estate, you guys will hear it's location, location, and location. The Persian Empire, at least, is one of the earliest empires to control this most important location on the map. And it's so important, especially for trade and cultural context, because it brings Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and Northeast Africa together. All right? And we already talked. What is going to be heading all the way from East Asia and Eastern China, all the way over land in through those Silk Roads are going to go right into the Persian Empire, okay? And actually connect with what the Persians called the Royal Road, their own road. We'll talk about this more next week. But the Persians were also building roads to connect their empire. You should be familiar with the name already, Cyrus the Great. He is the guy that organized the Persian Empire into what the Persian Empire would become. Of course, as we've already mentioned, not handing out flowers to neighbors, but by conquering other states. We already talked about Cyrus the Great defeating the Neo-Babylonians, right? Taking Babylon, allowing the Babylonian captivity of those Hebrews to end, and allowing those people to go back to Jerusalem and practice how they see fit. And as Cyrus the Great creates his empire, he is going to allow his subjects, all the different people of his empire, because you can imagine when you create an empire that's this massive, you're going to have a lot of different kinds of people. I call this in my classes a massive multi-ethnic empire. It's huge, and they've got a lot of different kinds of people. So when you create an empire like this, Cyrus is going to say, you guys can live kind of how you want to live. You guys can live how you want to live. You guys live how you want to live. Just pay your taxes and keep the peace. If you pay your taxes and keep the peace, everyone's cool. All right? There will be a Persian law code, but like other civilizations that base their current culture on some ideas of previous civilizations, much of the Persian law code is going to be based on earlier Mesopotamian law codes. So what do you think it might look a little bit like? Maybe some ideas of Hammurabi's code making their way into the Persian legal books. We didn't really talk about a Persian religion, but there is a religion of the Persian Empire, even though a lot of other people are going to practice their own religion, and that is called Zoroastrianism. I'm going to write that down. Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism. That's a tough one to say, right? This is the oldest monotheistic faith in the world. It even predates Judaism. Some date Zoroastrian beliefs to go all the way back to about 3500 BCE. And of course, it will be the religion of the Persian Empire. This is a one-God faith. It's the oldest monotheistic faith. Zoroastrian? Yeah. We're not going to get into the nuts and bolts, but it's kind of, we don't need to go too much beyond that, but the Zoroastrian religion teaches that there's this cosmic battle between good and evil, which kind of sounds like a battle, either Star Wars or maybe, God and Satan kind of thing. And there's a lot of religious scholarship that talks about the influence that Zoroastrianism is going to have on later monotheistic beliefs, including the Hebrew faith. Now, where are a bunch of Hebrews going to probably come in contact with the Zoroastrian faith? As they're in the Babylonian captivity and ultimately coming under the Persian control. So Zoroastrianism is said to influence, especially in views of good and evil and notions of like heaven and hell and such. The Persian Empire will later fight a series of wars against the Greek world, and we'll talk about this more next week when we talk about the Greek city-states. These are known conveniently as the Persian Wars. So the Greek city-states are going to get together and join forces to wage battle against the Persian Empire. Because you can see the Persian Empire stretches near and borders up against the Greek world. So as we're going to have some Greeks that don't want to be dominated by a Persian emperor or Persian king, we're going to end up having a war. This is in fact where a lot of our knowledge of the Persian Empire comes from. Not Persians themselves, but actually Greek historians. There's a Greek historian named, you don't need to write this, named Herodotus, who's known as like the father of history, like one of the first historians. He was a Greek guy, and he was writing the history of the Persian War. And in his history of the Persian War, how do you think the Persians come off? They're the bad guys in the war if you're the Greeks. So unfortunately, a lot of our record of who the Persians were and what they were all about ends up having the Persians be pretty rough. Now, the legacy of this is what we see in Hollywood a few years ago with the movie 300. Raise your hand if you've seen this. I know this is getting a little bit older now. You guys are so young. But maybe about 10 years ago, I think 300 came out.
My brother loves that.
Okay. Well, in that movie, you've got a Greek army, a Spartan army, right, who are trying to hold back a Persian army. And if you've seen the movie, the Persians not only come off as absolutely the bad guys, but also like monsters, and like the Darius, who's the king of the Persians against the Greeks there, is like made into a superhuman monster-like figure. Because the origins of the story of who the Persians were came from the Greeks. So the Persians don't look very good in them. We'll talk more about the Persian Wars when we talk about Greece, but for today, I think we've got now a decent understanding of Persian empires, Indian empires, a couple Chinese dynasties, and we're going to start wanting to think and spend some time thinking about what makes these places, these empires, and how they ruled themselves similar, what makes them unique from each other, and that's it for today.